Well, good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. We will be picking up where we left off in Genesis chapter 2. Yes, we are in the second chapter now. Where we left off last week, we began the second chapter and we spoke of how we kind of zoom in a little bit. The end of the first chapter, which we spoke of, we have the time of rest, and we spoke about why God institutes that day of rest, not that He needs it, but rather that it sets an example in many ways, both for a spiritual and physical reason for us, and for the Jews later on as well, or earlier on than us, rather. And then we get to chapter 2, where we see that everything is done. God sanctifies it, sees it is very good, the uniqueness of man within creation. And then we get a little bit of a snapshot of a zoom in time to when things are still being created. And we talked about the mist or the canopy that filled the earth, and made the point that the creation is very different from what it was pre-flood to what it is now that we see on the world. That the ecology is different, the way that the ground is watered and the plants are watered is different. This brings us to what we're going to zoom in more on, is looking at the creation of man, Adam and Eve, and then their responsibilities that man is given over creation. We touched a little bit on that last week, how man is put over creation, how the animals are meant to serve them, and the food is from the plants and the trees are meant to sustain them. And we're going to get a little more detail on that as we zoom into the formation of man and woman. We're going to move past, or look first before we get to that, of where Eden is located. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but it is interesting to look at the specificity God talks about with the formation of the Garden of Eden. Ian, can I get you to read for me verses 7 through... we'll go ahead and do 7 through 14. Thank you. So we also see verse 15, the Lord will put God into the garden, but we'll read that in a second. So we see after God, so we're clearly on the sixth day, man is created. God breathes life into the nostrils of Adam, becoming a living being, or man rather, becoming a living being. And then we get this detail of Eden. Again, we're not going to spend too much time on this, just a few points. What is in Eden, as described by the passage we just read? Possibly gold, but as far as what's in the garden itself, what did God make there? We have trees. What else? Food. Jessica? Okay? That's a good way of putting it. It's a place where Adam it should be able to sustain himself and provide food for himself there from the plants and the trees. It says that there is every good thing to eat there is put in the garden. Anything else? Well, there's a river, but there are two special trees. Tree of life and the fruit tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is a mouthful. Yes, I can't help but not say that. It's always is a mouthful. Tree of life, nice and pithy. Tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's just a mouthful to say. But we have both trees being put there, so there is something unique and special about Eden. It's not just this luxurious garden that everything is green and bountiful and all of the food is there. Every plant you could think of is there. There's also these two special trees, which of course will play a very big factor into chapter 3. And then, as was already mentioned by Dana, we have 4 rivers. One which is dictated by the gold that is found there, and then we have the Gishon, which is the land of Cush being in Africa, and then the Tigris and Euphrates, which we still see today, is in sort of Mesopotamia, Iran, Iraq area. And the thing is about these rivers, man has been able to kind of have an idea of where the garden could be, but it's not something that man has ever found past chapter 3. And there's good reason to that, but why do you think God spends this much ink, I mean that metaphorically, to describe these rivers? We've kind of talked about this a little bit in earlier classes, but why? You ever stop and ask yourself, okay, God, why did you have Moses talk about these 4 rivers coming out of Eden? What's the point? So they can find it, but... They can go there, right? Why can't they go there? Well, we'll talk about that in chapter 3, but when Adam and Eve are out of the garden, God essentially places guards on it, and no one can ever go in, and man is never really able to find it. But that's not a bad idea, so that it can be found. Judy?
But it proves that geography is real. It's to this day, the exact same things are still there.
Exactly. So Judy makes a great point, and this is kind of along what Dana, I think you were kind of getting at, is the geography is real. The Tigris, the Euphrates, these are real places that we still can find on a map. Now, the first river that's named the Pishon, it's archaeologists and anthropologists have had a hard time, and biblical scholars, of pinpointing where exactly that river is. But Tigris and Euphrates, we know where that is. We know what the Gishon is. This sets very clearly that God's not just making this up. It is so geographically located in our world that it is real. There's details and specificity, kind of what Dana was saying, so that man can go and find these places and go, oh, this is a real spot on this earth. God isn't just, this isn't just some fantastic metaphorical garden. There was a real spot where it is, or was. And we'll get more into the is and the was of it in chapter 3. Jessica, you had your hand up.
One of the things that's interesting about it is that he's able to describe it, and this is even after the flood, that the river is still around, even after the flood, and that changed everything. So these are some substantial rivers.
That's a great point. So much of the Earth's geography seems to change after the floods, and as Jessica just mentioned, the fact that these rivers are still just as discernible and definable shows that they were great rivers, that they are still a part of the world even when Moses is originally writing this, these rivers are something that exist, or even in the time of Abraham, who comes from the Ur of the Chaldees, which is between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And that's a great point, that these rivers survive and are still a major landmark even after the cataclysm of the flood. Great point. Well, no, they all are. It's just Tigris and Euphrates is the most, at least for me, the most famous ones. You could argue with the Gishon that that's referring to the Nile, and that's a pretty famous river too. But the Pishon has undergone so many name changes that it's hard for us to pinpoint that one. Just Tigris and Euphrates is one, fun to say, and two, probably the most famous of them, at least in my mind.
So we think that the Gihon may now be the Nile?
Well, it is a river that flows through the land of Cush, the land of Cush being sort of Egypt and Ethiopia. And it's a great river of which all those societies are sort of funneled. So, anyway, any quick questions on that before we move forward? Carrie?
Having a discernible geography tends to add credibility to the two trees in the book.
Exactly. Great point. So, any quick comments or questions before we move on from there? All right. So let's pick up in verse 15, and we'll go ahead and we'll split this up because I want to just have it read through the end of the chapter. So if someone could read for me verses 15 through 19. Who can I pick on? Richard Thomas, would you read verses 15 through 19? And then Ken, could I get you to read verses 20 through 25 in chapter 2? Go ahead, Richard.
15 through 19.
Yes,
And
sir.
I will put enmity between you and the...
Of chapter 2?
Oh, I'm in 3. I'm moving ahead. Start over again. Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat from it, you shall surely die. And I'm reading to 19.
Yes, sir.
Then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone, and I will make him a helper suitable for him. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name.
The man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in that place. The Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man, and brought her to the man. The man said, this now, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed.
All right, thank you. So there's a lot of points we can sort of focus on here, and we're going to try and go through them in a somewhat orderly manner, but you know how my brain works. First of all, let's look at verse 15. Obviously, verse 15 is very clear. Man is put in the garden, but does man have a job, or does he just get to live there and enjoy the wonderful Garden of Eden, or is there something else for him to do? He's supposed to tend it, cultivate it, and keep it, or tend it, whatever synonym you want to use there. So he has a job. There is a responsibility that man is given in the garden to cultivate it and keep it or to tend it. There's a responsibility there. Now, does that mean that he's not allowed to touch it or to use it? Because what do we see in the next couple of verses? You can do what from the trees? Eat it. And I know some of us that might seem, well, why make that distinction? It's important to understand the limits and to understand what the responsibility of keeping and tending something means, because some people think today that if you're going to tend and keep something, you don't really touch it or you use it. It's just, I kind of keep it going, but I don't really take advantage of the thing that I'm tending. Now, those of you that keep gardens are probably going, that makes no sense. And you're right. That distinction doesn't make much sense. But there are people that look at the way that man uses creation and think that we may overstep certain bounds. Now, Cindy, you made sure we were very clear on this last week, and it bears repeating, as much as it pains my soul. Man at this time were essentially vegetarians. They were not eating meat. That does not come until later that man begins to use cattle and to use animals for meat. So, Adam and Eve are vegetarians. Ugh, it hurts. But it was sustainable for them. So, of course, there is a slightly different context when we talk about the parts of creation that we get to use and the way we get to use it, because, of course, we use animals for food in a way that they did not at this time, or that they did not in the garden. But if any of you remember from last week, I sort of teed up the question to think about what the responsibility man has when it comes to creation, and if there's limits to that responsibility and what that responsibility looks like. And I want us to take a few minutes, or a few moments rather, while we're looking at this, and we look from verse 15 on down to verse 20. When we see God giving the responsibility to man or to Adam, and then the way that Adam is put over creation, is there anything we can glean from this, anything we can observe about man's sort of responsibility and relationship to the natural world?
I mean, from reading it, I see we're supposed to take care of it, but we are also at the top of any kind of food chain.
Yeah, I think that's very clear, is we are to keep it and to cultivate the garden, and then we can sort of see that extended out in chapter 3 to nature itself, to work the ground, so on and so forth. But as you observe, Christina, we are on the top because man is the one naming the animals. Man is the one that is put above. The animals are going to be helpers, or put in front of man to be a helper, to be the one that assists man. That means man is above, is given authority. We talked about that last week as well. Any other ideas on the relationship and the responsibility of man with nature here as we see in these passages?
By comparison, all the animals, God considers Adam to be alone in that capacity. That it's the first time in verse 18 that he says that it's not good.
That's a great point. Once again, we talked about this last week of man's role in creation. He does not look at animals as equal to Adam. It says Adam is alone. There is no one that is suitable to help Adam. And you have every animal in creation, and yet they're all found in comparison to Adam is alone. That's showing that in the eyes of God, man and animals are not equal. There is a hierarchy there. James?
It also goes to set precedents for future humanity. It's like you're supposed to rule over the earth, conquer the earth, subdue
Mm-hmm. Exactly one of the points. I'm glad you said that, James. 100% is, we get these. There are people that get a very skewed opinion of man's relationship with nature. We are put above it, and it makes no sense to worship something that we are meant to be put over, that is meant to serve us. That's not how worship works. You only worship things that are greater than yourself, and God is very clear here that the world is under our care and responsibility, that we are to subdue it and tame it, and we are put on top. Makes no sense to then, we flip that and say, no, we're subservient to nature. Nature is at our rule. I mean, look at most ancient pagan pantheistic religions. If you look at a lot of their deities, they were deities that were based upon attributes of nature: sun gods, moon gods, river gods, gods of the ocean, gods of the sands, gods of the plains, gods of the mountains, gods of rain, god of storms, thunder, lightning. That's exactly what James is saying. Even there we see that nature is something to be worshipped. And that is not how God set up the system.
I don't even let my children say they love their dog.
Well, Justin, you...
It's the word love cheap. They don't get to love pizza and love their mom.
Yes.
I take it from this principle.
Oh, and I think there's a logic to it. You may be on a limb on exactly how you go about that, but that's for you, Justin. But there is a certain principle there of not making the word love cheap and understanding the hierarchy of man within this creation that God has made. There is a difference. All right, a lot of hands shot up there. Judy, and then...
He named them all. Man named all the animals.
Yes. Yeah. Man is the one that gave animals names, gave them their identity. It's a great point. Was there another hand over here? Okay, guess I'm going nuts. Richard?
I was just going to say, someone might say, someone was wise to say that while their wife was not in here.
She knows.
I'm not going to touch that one too much. Randall?
Well, it comes down to man is the only one who can reason, so they should be.
Exactly. It goes back, we made that point in chapter 1, the ability of man to reason, to have the inner self, to be made in the image of God. There's a separation, that hierarchy. Was there another hand that I missed? Dana?
So, if what gives Adam authority over the animals is that he named them, he named woman also.
Well, we'll get to that. The reason, though, that man has authority over animals is also there are other parts where we see, and we talked about this last week in chapter 1. I think you were teaching the kids last week. In chapter 1, in verse 29, it says, "Then God said, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed and is on the surface of the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you, and every beast of the earth and every bird of the sky and everything that moves. I have given every green on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food," and it was so. So before Adam even names them all, God says, I've given all these things to you in subjection to you. So it's not just that he named him, that's another example of how man has authority over the animals. God already said that in a more expansive sense in chapter 1, and we did touch on that last week. Carrie?
If he's able to name the animals, God created them in language. Which I hope he can write down, because that's a lot of animals.
Oh, that's a great point too, and I was going to get to that, and I'm glad you brought it up, is one of the more subtle things is from the very beginning man had language. which is not how man thinks man came into existence. That written language and spoken language was something that man evolved from cave paintings to very primitive drawings and grunts and groans. That language was something that evolved very late in the process. And yet here we see Adam is given breath in his lungs, the animals are created, and he's already giving them names. So the language as it is told, if we're looking at this story literally, and we've already gone through, over the last couple of weeks, the literal versus if this is metaphorical, and talked about that. But if we take this to be straightly literal in the way the timeline is unfolding, Adam is created. Very, very, very shortly after that, Adam is then speaking and naming things. So there's already a word, a language that Adam has, which flies in the face of how man thinks we develop. Cindy?
Reading the timeline of God, God is wanting to not have him be alone.
Mm-hmm.
Then he shows the animals and what do you call this? And I think it's to help Adam eventually see when he finally sees a suitable helper that he needs.
Fantastic point, and a wonderful segue. There you go, Randy. Segues. Yes. But no, that's a fantastic segue into the next section, talking about the creation of woman. You're 100% right on that timeline, and why there's an interesting little detail here is he finds that Adam needs help. So every animal is brought before Adam to see if the animal is suitable, and none are found suitable. And it's interesting to think of what Adam is thinking as he goes through this of, wow, everything on creation is inferior and not suitable to help me in the way that I need. So that when woman is created, there's that automatic sense of something is different here. There is a sense that she is the helper that he needs, and that no animal is capable or suitable to fill that role of. So that at no point can Adam go, well, what about the Tyrannosaurus Rex over there? That could have been a helper. God, you didn't let me see that animal, but what about that bird up there? No, it says every animal was brought forward before Adam to see if it was suitable for a helper, and none of them were found suitable. None of the cattle, none of the beasts on the earth, none of the birds, none of them were found to be suitable to be the helper that Adam needed. It wasn't until woman is made that that suitable helper is found. Cindy?
Assuming that God had these animals procreating, pairing up like they do now.
Well, yeah,
That
of course.
also become apparent to Adam. They all have mates and they have communities, and I'm all by myself.
It's an interesting point as well of what would be in the future. Of, they propagate and then Adam is by himself. That's an interesting point. So we see, of course, and I think many of us know this story of, woman is fashioned out of the rib of Adam, right? Woman is literally part of man. They are fashioned from man, and Eve is made, and she is made to be Adam's helper. And careful, some of you men looking at your wives right now. But we understand that there is a purpose behind this creation, just as there was a purpose behind man's creation. And when they are fashioned together, Adam says in verse 23, the man rather, "This is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." And then verse 24, this is speaking more universally here. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So, a lot of points we can sort of draw from this, and I think some are more more elementary points. But I want us to think of this. So, going back to the overall creation, and we'll get into more specific things about the relationship of man and woman in a second. So you have man, you have woman. Their hierarchy in nature is firmly established through the perspective of God. Is there a limit, or rather, is there a way for their responsibility to be, the word I had just poofed right out of my head, to not fulfill that responsibility, and is there a limit to that responsibility? And to make that a little more plain, is we are told to cultivate and keep, well, they are told to cultivate and keep the garden, and then later we see that being man to all the earth. Is there a way that we can either abuse or not meet that standard of responsibility? What would that look like? How so?
Well, I don't know, I can't remember the exact, but animals have become like, I don't know, the elk or wild wolves were thought to be God because too many people were killing them and that kind of thing. Because people overhunt or overfish,
Mm-hmm.
they deplete the species. Is that what you meant? That we have to be
Well,
responsible?
that's kind of what I want us to be thinking about. If that is us as men not abusing the responsibility God gives us or not holding to that responsibility to keep nature, and I kind of want us to start thinking about that. Is there a responsibility we of man have for the preservation of species? Is there a biblical responsibility given to us to have a certain gear towards the environment, to do X, Y, or Z? Or are we giving man more credit for our impact on the world than we actually have? I want us to think about that because there's a lot of individuals that believe in some form of God and hold to Christianity will look at Genesis 2 and say, well, we as Christians ought to do X, Y, Z. You ought to not hunt animals. You ought not to do this, ought not to do that, because that's not holding the responsibility we have to keep and cultivate nature. What do you guys think about all that? Cindy? That's a great point. It changes after the flood. It's an important context. But and you're right, that does change things. But what about those that would try to use these verses? Is there anything internally besides just the context? What about the responsibility that God gives man there? Christina?
I think it's a responsibility. We're supposed to tend, take care of it, but he's also told you're supposed to use it.
Yes.
So, I mean, there comes a point where if you're going to cut down trees to build houses, you should probably like replace the trees, right? Because somebody else is going to want to buy a house later or build a house later. Or if you're hunting, you only hunt what you can eat. You don't need to hunt it for its teeth and its claws to hand out as souvenirs. You hunt what you're going to eat. You take the whole thing. You're using the hide. You're using everything. But I think a lot of people have decided, oh, it's just free for all, and I can get whatever I want, and I can leave a bunch of stuff behind and waste it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I think that's an interesting point to make. Ian?
My opinion, it comes back to the command that's given to Adam. That's even part of the reason why the woman appears. In 1:28, God blessed him and said to him, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it,
Mhm.
That Hebrew word for subdue is more akin to enslave. It's a very harsh, strong word.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily adversarial, but it can be understood as a way to exploit the things that you need from by controlling it.
Mhm.
So to say that you can't touch this thing on the earth because you don't have that right, I would argue that's not the command. The command is the exact opposite of what was given.
Right.
Can we, of course, be overzealous or abuse that power? Absolutely. And we'll see that in the third chapter.
Mhm.
But the idea, you can't have this or you shouldn't do that, needs to be tempered heavily with the idea of we are entitled to what this earth can give to us, and that is a decree of God.
I think that's extremely well said. Of looking at that idea of be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And going back to the Greek, if we're subduing something, we are taking dominance over it. And I like that you go to I said Greek, to the Hebrew, and look at the original language, that it is close, more akin to almost enslave, not to the adversarial sense as you said, but you can exploit this. You'll have some that view themselves as Christians say, no, you don't have the right to exploit the earth and draw certain minerals from it. There is a temperance, and I'm glad you brought this up too. There's a balance here to strike. But God is very clear that we as man are given authority over the creation to not just use it, but to use it to our ends. Now, as Christina brought up, this is a sort of balancing point to not go too extreme with that, is there are ways that man can abuse nature too far. And I think too, we have to also remember that, well, we'll get to that point in a second. Judy?
Well, there's hunting season, you can only hunt certain times or taking care of that. I grew up in Washington, you have high tides in the winter, and you can't dig the clams and the oysters. But in summer, you have much lower tides, you can go out and dig clams and pick up oysters. So nature kind of helps control it as well.
And that's fantastic for the next thing that I want to say about nature. Justin, I know you have some.
I have the mean comment, because we give hierarchy in our society to certain things. Like we're like, oh, we'll kill all the bugs. They're coming into my house. It's messed up, right? And like in Texas, where my family lives now, they kill hogs for no reason because they're destructive. They don't eat them. They're overpopulated and they wipe them out in certain areas because it messes up some of the other things that we're trying to accomplish.
And then you have to wonder why they're overpopulated. Who let them get that way?
I don't know. There's a fairness to that, or some discretion to that, but it's perspective oftentimes that we have.
Well, and this is why I said that there's a balance to this. And we're not trying to go into setting hard and fast rules here, but there's understanding this principle of, and what I really want to get at is the point that the biblical principle here is very clear, that man is given reign over the world and told to subdue it, to make it bend to its whims. There are ways that we can abuse that responsibility, right? There are specific examples we could think of, but just a general principle. We talk about this with the relationship of man and woman, right? Man is given rule over the house, but man can abuse that responsibility and abuse that authority given to him. And it says right after that, what? Love your wives. There's a balance there. And this is not Robert trying to say don't go hunt or don't fish this much, or make sure you get all your limits, or take all the guts out of it and repurpose. It's not what we're trying to say here. That's up to your own conscience. But what I want to be clear on is that God gives us reign to use the creation. and to make sure that it keeps going. Now, to Judy's point, and this is the last thing I want to say, and then I know there's a couple hands up. Nature, we also have to be aware. Let's start with Ecclesiastes 1 just very quickly. Is that God has set up this system, to Ian's point, to be used, right? God created the systems of nature for man to use, so you would think God would have fail-safes and have a certain resilience for man's interaction with creation. And when we look at chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, we're not going to read all of it, but if you read the first 7 verses, or first 8 verses, the point that the preacher is making in these first 8 verses is saying that man has no real impact on nature. That no matter what man does, the sun's still going to rise in the east, or, wait, did I get that backwards? No, okay, rise in the east, sets in the west. Sun is still going to rise and fall. The seas are still going to have their currents, they're still going to flow one way. The winds are going to blow. And that man is never going to be able to leave a big enough impact on the world to actually change the way that the world functions. That is his point of saying why all is vanity, is no matter how great of a man, of a human being you think you are, your actual long-lasting impact on the world, it doesn't last. And so if we match this to the point that we're talking about with, man's relationship to creation, we also have to remember that God made nature and the creation extremely resilient. That, things happen in nature where nature takes care of themselves. For example, 'tis the season in California. What do we got all around us, north, south? Starts with an F. Fires. Okay, and I know some of you know this. If we're talking from a purely nature standpoint, are fires a good thing or a bad thing? Why are they a good thing? Exactly, because you have new growth come in. There are certain conifers, certain trees, where their seeds only sprout through extreme heat. You can only get new life through destruction. Man didn't do that. We didn't program it that way. That is God who has made nature, who has programmed that to work this way or that, and we as man freak out. Oh no! Stop the fires. Well, you're always going to have fires. Because that's part of nature. That's part of the cycles that the preacher talks about in chapter 1 that God made. And yes, we've had some, there's things man did to overhunt, to cause some things to change. But there's also the argument of, well, if it was not their time to go, then they would survive. Or what impact would it have? And I'm not saying that in a very callous way. Look, I'm an old school hunter personally. You keep and you take and you use what you kill. My point being is, to Judy's point earlier of, the seashells, they come in, they replenish themselves. We take, then nature replenishes. And sometimes certain things get out of hand because of man's interference. You're not allowed to hunt these certain animals, so then they grow way disproportionately and start damaging the environment, which is why hogs are so destructive. If you've ever seen what a hog can do, it's like a rototiller goes through. Nothing's left. But to not get lost too far in the details, the point is that man is given a responsibility, again, to rule over nature, to subdue nature, to keep and to tend the garden, but also a responsibility over the earth where we are in charge. We can abuse that authority, but also nature is highly resilient. This is why to think that man would have such an impact on the earth to where we could permanently change the weather, the geography of the planet, actually flies in the face of what God says through the preacher in Ecclesiastes. And it really flies in the face of something we'll see in chapter 3. Any last comments or questions on this before we end? Richard, yeah, I apologize. You had your hand up earlier.
Sorry, I was just going to say, moderation in all things probably would be a general rule that we could help guide us.
Exactly.
And I think back to the Indian way of life as they depended upon bison
Mm-hmm.
for everything. Their winter coats, their floors, uh, just about everything, their way of life. And mankind came through, the white man, if you want to get rid of, came through and destroyed their way of life because, and they left it laying on the ground. They didn't eat it, they didn't use their coat, the pelts off of them, etc. So I think that we need to be aware that moderation has to come into play there.
That's a great point. And that is kind of what we're getting at is you can go one way or the other. The real point that, and along the point that Ian made, that I really want us to have a firm idea of is that God is the one who establishes our role on the planet and gives us the authority and permission over creation to subdue it. And that needs to be done in moderation, to not abuse it, but we are given the permission and told, go out. This planet is for you to use and to be dominant over. So be very careful, I think, if you have that opinion of going too far to say the scripture forbids us or we as Christians are failing in our responsibility to tend the earth because we're taking some minerals out of the ground. It's not really what this passage is saying. So,
The perversion of that comes to mind, which I think you're probably getting to, is also the idea that you'll hear some say now, which is there's too many people on the planet.
Yeah.
Right? That's direct contradiction to be fruitful and multiply and subdue.
yes.
Right? So to preserve the planet over humanity is a perversion of that.
And again, marrying that with Ecclesiastes 1, you think God didn't foresee how many people might exist on the planet at any one time? There's that hubris that I think really sneaks in here when we talk about this. But that is all the time that we have for this evening. Really, really appreciate everyone's comments, and we'll get into chapter 3. Well, we have a little bit more to talk about in chapter 2, and then we'll get into chapter 3 maybe next week. No promises. But with that being said, Oscar, would you mind leading us in a closing word of prayer? Amen.